We are starting off a new series today on a topic that is one of the most rewarding and at the same most frustrating things in your life. It's something that when they go poorly, it can be all-consuming and it can wreck all areas of your life. It can cause you to lose sleep at night and derail your plans for yourself. It's something that when they go well, you take pictures, you post about them on social media, and you celebrate them, and they are a highlight of your year. We're going to start a conversation about relationships. And we're going to call this series Emotionally Healthy Relationships. Relationships are everywhere, right? Think about all the areas. So you have your family, right, with your parents or with your children, with your spouse, with maybe someone you're dating. You have relationships at work with your boss, if you're a manager, you have direct reports, you have coworkers and peers, you have clients and prospects and customers. If you're in school, you have relationships with teachers and friends, and if you play sports, you have coaches and teammates. You have the opposition in the community, you have neighbors, and you have people that you just see at the ball field or you see in the grocery store. On social media, you're interacting relationally with everyone, or with people. Relationships are everywhere. As you think about relationships in your life, can you think of one that maybe is stuck or needs to be improved? How many of you would say, yes, there's at least one relationship I can think of right now that is stuck or needs improved? Okay. Most of you raised your hand. Those of you that didn't raise your hand, there's probably a lack of self-awareness maybe. Maybe someone else raised their hand about you, right? But relationships are everywhere. None of us are so isolated that we don't have to engage relationally with others. It's interesting as you think about how we raise our children and even as adults. Most of you went to school probably for at least 12 years. You did elementary, middle school, high school. Some of you then went on to a trade school. Some of you went on to college or university. Some of you went into the military. And so for many of you, you spent maybe 12 to 20 years or more, like Dr. Lyon here, probably more, right? You've spent 12 to 20 years at least being educated, learning about science and math and history and your trade. I have teenagers and they're thinking about college, and I was researching tuition rates. And this coming year, a private school, the average is $41,000 per year for a private school. A public in-state school is $11,000, and a public out-of-state, if you're an out-of-state student, it's in the mid to high 20s. And so not only do you spend 12 to 20 years being educated, but you also spend tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars on education. And through everything that we go through that we're intentional about, one of the things we're never intentional about educating and really focusing on is relationships. When I would suggest probably, not that all the other things we learn aren't important, but relationships are probably even more important because they permeate our workplaces and our families and our schools and our communities. And I think there's a lack, even in the church, of really focusing on doing relationships well. One day, some religious leaders came up to Jesus, and some people were having a conversation, and they said, Jesus, we know the Old Testament, because they had the Old Testament then. Out of everything in the Old Testament, there's all these laws, there's all these rules, there's all these commandments in there. It's a lot. It kind of feels like a lot. And they asked a question I would probably ask, is like, out of everything in there, what's most important? If I was just going to focus on one thing, what would it be? And Jesus responded with this. He said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength and with all of your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so what he points to is that the most important thing as Christians we can focus on, the measure of our maturity is all about love. It's about loving God and it's about loving others. And love doesn't happen outside of relationship. Our interaction with God is all about relationship. Our interaction with those around us is all about relationship. And that's what Jesus points to as being the most important. That's the mark of maturity. That's the mark of a mature Christian. And Paul later then goes on to reaffirm this in probably what is the most famous verses Paul ever writes, because if you've ever been to a wedding, you've probably heard these at some point when he talks about love. In 1 Corinthians 13, he says this. He says, if I speak in tongues of men or angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. See, we live in a world where we celebrate people of faith that have lots of Bible knowledge. Or we look at someone that is just serving nonstop, and we say, wow, that's a mature Christian. Or we look at someone that gives sacrificially and gives everything they have, or gives extreme financially, or just gives of themselves to serve and help others. Or we look at people that can stand up here and pray, and maybe there's an anointing you have that more so than normal. Like when you pray for someone to get healed physically, that they get healed or they get set free, or someone that can give prophetic words up on a stage like this, and we celebrate those people. And what Paul says is you can do all of that, and it be for nothing. Because none of that is worth anything. None of that matters if it's not done in love. In his letter to Galatians, he said the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And so we can talk about fruitfulness, and we can talk about ministry, and we can talk about theology and Bible knowledge, and you can have all of that. But if you aren't handling relationships well, if you aren't loving others well, we are missing it as Christians. And the challenge with relationships is, as we biologically mature, right? As we chronologically get older, and we have birthday after birthday, right? Happy birthday, Renee. We just had her birthday yesterday. As we turn a year older biologically, it doesn't mean that we become relationally more mature. That doesn't happen automatically. I know some 55-year-olds and 65-year-olds that are relational infants. And I also know some teenagers or people in their 20s that are very mature and God-honoring in how they handle and pursue relationships with others. And so let's not, for those of us that are later in life, let's not be prideful enough to think that we have this figured out. No, we can get better. We can do better. And for those of you that are earlier in life, and that, I remember being in my 20s and people looking down on me, right? It happened in work. It happened in church. Those older, like, well, you don't know yet. You haven't lived enough life yet. And oftentimes, early in life, you can be, you can feel like, well, what do I really have to offer? And we see in the Bible, Jeremiah actually deals with that. God is using him in a powerful way, and he says, don't let people look down on you because of your age. And so even if you're a teenager or if you're just starting out your career, you can do this really well. And you can do this actually better than those that are 20 or 30 years older than you. And so age has nothing to do with your relational maturity and your ability to do relationships well and to honor God in them. And relationships, this doesn't just matter at church, right? This matters in all areas of our life. And one of the things researchers have found is that over the last 15 to 20 years, we've actually gotten worse at having face-to-face conversations, looking people in the eye. Now, technology is part of what's made that more challenging for us. But just this past week, we were training at work, one of our clients, we were training their HR and talent acquisition teams, and we were talking about how is it you build trust with others in your company. And one of the things we got on was communication. Because one of the things with communication is that the most efficient and easy way to communicate is not always the most effective way to communicate. And so we showed this graph, and more than anything else we showed them, this really resonated, was just this idea that what's the easiest way to communicate, especially at work? I see some of you shaking your head, right? It's email. And why do we like email? Because you can sit there and you can craft it and you can rewrite it and you can think about it and you can perfectly articulate it. And then when you send it, you hit send and you don't have to think about it anymore. I'm done, right? It's all on them now. But we all know, if I asked you how many unread messages are in your inbox right now, we all know that email is terrible, a terrible way to communicate. It's not effective, especially for important conversations. It doesn't have the impact we want, and it can be misinterpreted and misread, and practically it usually gets lost and overwhelmed. People get overwhelmed with emails. And so what's better than that? Well, it's better to text or to chat or to use Slack or Teams or whatever you might use at work. And what's even better than that is, especially in a post-COVID world, is to have a face-to-face video call or video conversation. And that's better, and that's more impactful. And even better than that would be to talk to someone face-to-face. My coworker Ashton, who was helping me, she gave this example. She said, could you imagine, like, in your house with your family, with your spouse and your kids, if the only way you communicated was via email? What kind of relationships, what kind of effect would you have? It wouldn't be a very healthy household, would it? Now, I have teenagers. I've actually been told by them, Dad, this is a hard topic. Let's text about it instead of talking about it face-to-face. But if you want to have impactful conversations, you've got to have those face-to-face. And that's just a part of doing relationships well. In the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 1 and 2, we see the standard of how God intends relationships to be, right? There's wholeness. We see Adam and Eve relating to one another as God intended. We see them relating to God as he intended. And then sin comes in Genesis 3, and we still live with the repercussions of a broken world that's sin-filled. And it impacts our relationships in extreme ways. No one ever sets out and says, you know what, I hope this is a dysfunctional relationship. I hope this marriage doesn't make it. No one ever sets out and says that. I hope my relationship with my boss at my new job is just toxic and terrible. No one sets out and says that, do they? No one wants that. But it's the reality of sin, isn't it? That we have relationships, and we didn't have good relationships modeled for us when we were growing up. A lot of this we pick up honestly. And we saw distrust, and we saw lying, and we saw people with anger, and we saw people overreacting through emotions, or you've been hurt, and you've been wounded, you've been abandoned. Some of you have been abused. And relationally, we become kind of dysfunctional and broken. And so our prayer for this series, our prayer for these next several weeks is that we move from a place of brokenness to a place of wholeness, to a place where the relationships that matter in our lives, we can approach one another, we can be honest, we can be whole and have courage to have the tough conversations. We can not be afraid of conflict, but deal with it head on. That we increase our self-awareness, and there's freedom and there's honesty. That's where we want to get to. And we're going to do that not just on Sunday mornings, and there's some other resources and tools we're going to make available, because Sunday mornings isn't enough for this. It's not enough to just come in and learn some knowledge or be inspired. This takes work. This takes practice. This takes wrestling through some of these ideas and some of these concepts, because these don't happen naturally. Naturally, brokenness happens. Wholeness takes effort. But the good news is if we put in the effort, God honors that. And God is there on the journey with us. So today, I want to just focus for a few minutes here on the time we have left on assumptions and expectations. Because assumptions and expectations impact all of our relationships, and it's kind of, in many ways, the foundation for a lot of what else we're going to do over the coming weeks. Now, Courtney and I, we got married 19 and a half years ago, and when we got married, we tried to do it right. Like we wanted to honor God in it. And so we went through premarital counseling. We read some books together about relationships. We didn't have sex until our wedding night. We didn't move in together and live together until after we were married. We even went to a marriage retreat that actually Pastor Tony was helping lead. We were the only engaged couple there. And we got to sit through the whole thing up until the very last session that was on intimacy, and then they kicked us out. I don't know why. But Courtney and I, we didn't even kiss until our wedding day. Now that's not a biblical thing, and I'm not putting that on anyone. But we just knew we both sucked at self-control, and let's not even start it, right? We'd made mistakes in the past. And one of the reasons I love this picture, two reasons. One is my bride looks beautiful in it, and I absolutely love it. But also a few hours after this was taken, I got to kiss her for the first time. And so this is, a special picture. So we went on our honeymoon, then we came back and we moved in together. And I remember our first couple weeks was very frustrating. And it was all about ice cube trays and vacuums that caused the frustration. Because we were just starting out and we didn't have one of those fancy refrigerators that makes your own ice. And so we had ice cube trays. And I remember, doing the ice cube trays, and you know how ice cube trays work. Like, you always got to fill them up, and you empty them and you use them, then you got to fill them up again because they're not very big. And I remember multiple times over the first few weeks of living together that I would go to get ice, and the trays would be mostly empty. And I would get so frustrated because obviously Courtney didn't care about me and wasn't thinking about my needs, and she was being very inconsiderate, right? And I had all these thoughts about why the trays were empty. And then when I lived by myself, when you're a single guy living alone in an apartment, like, you come in, it's easy, right? You come up with the routines and you do what you want. And so one of the things I would do every Saturday morning when I lived by myself is I would clean the apartment. And when you live by yourself, it's easy. Like, you don't make it messy, right? I wasn't having big parties or anything. And so it took me like an hour. But every Saturday morning, I just liked for it to be clean. And so that's how I would start off my weekend. And when we got married, for some reason, Courtney did not want to start her weekend off by cleaning the house. She's like, hey, we've worked hard all week. Let's relax. Let's sleep in. Let's hang out with friends. Let's have fun. Let's enjoy it. And I got so frustrated. I'm like, well, why doesn't she, this is just what you do. And why doesn't she want the house to be clean? And I just remember the first several weeks, out of everything we had did to be intentional about doing things right with our getting married and premarital counseling and books, like this basic idea of us dealing with our assumptions and expectations for one another, like, we didn't have that figured out. Or at least I didn't have it figured out. It was really more of a me issue than it was a her issue. All right. I mean, she's phenomenal at managing our household and caring for it. And nowadays she drags me along. She's like, we need to pick up, or we need to take care of this. And it was all my issues. I mean, she was great at that. We just had different assumptions and different expectations that we hadn't dealt with. And so it was a challenge, and it was frustrating. And the thing with assumptions is that assumptions are about motivation and behavior, or motivations and thoughts that you're believing about someone else. And really what you're doing when you're making an assumption about someone and you're not talking about it, you're not verifying it, is you're constructing this mental model or this story in your head about the other person. And oftentimes, especially when there's disappointment or frustration and you're making assumptions, oftentimes that picture we create and that story we tell ourselves is not true. It's actually a lie. Because that's not really what they believe or what they're thinking, but it's what we're assuming. And the Bible actually would call this false testimony. The 10 Commandments, number 9, says, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Now, typically, when I remember learning, or when we teach it in Sunday school to our kids, and I remember when I learned about this, false testimony was a lie. Like, you don't want to lie to other people. Yes, that applies to this. But I would suggest anytime you make an assumption about someone else without verifying it, where it possibly could not be true, you're violating this commandment. Because you can't read their minds. You don't really know what their motives are. You don't really know what their thoughts are. And this isn't just an issue for newly married people. You go on a first date or a second date with someone, and it's been 2 or 3 days and you've not heard from them. What do you assume? Well, they didn't think it went well. They don't like me. Church lobby. You walked in today. You said hi to someone. They didn't say hi back to you. Some of you had this happen. What do you assume? What story do you start telling yourself? You have lunch scheduled with a friend, and life's a little crazy, and you need to reschedule it, but you just know that they're going to get mad at you or be disappointed. Like, do you really know that? Or are you just assuming that? You have kids that love spending time with their family, and then as they become teenagers and they become more social and then more, they can drive now. Like, you do family time, and they don't want to spend family time with you. They'd rather go hang out with your friends. Like, what story do you start telling yourself? What do you start assuming about them? You're on a sports team and you don't get past the ball. What do you assume? At work, you were promised you were going to get a promotion or a raise. It's been a month since that you were told that. Nothing's happened. what do you assume? What story do you start telling yourself about your boss and what's important to them and what their motivations are? See, every time we make an assumption about someone who has hurt or disappointed us, without confirming it, we potentially believe a lie. Every time. Every time you get hurt or disappointed by someone else and you start going through assumptions of why they did what they did or why they didn't do what they did, what they didn't do, you are potentially believing a lie. And we start putting together these counterfeit stories in our head and these pictures about the other person, and then we get frustrated and we wonder, like we're praying, God, why don't you come into this situation and why aren't you helping out this relationship? Because we have a God of truth. And we have a God of justice. And we have a God that if we've built up this story of lies about someone else based on all these false assumptions, like that's contradictory to who God is. And so sometimes we get disappointed and we get frustrated. How many times have you laid in bed at night replaying a situation, an interaction you had with someone, and you're losing sleep over it, and you just replay it over and over, and you think through like why they did what they did, why they didn't do what they did, and you just start having these, you lose sleep over it, and you get frustrated, and you get anxious, and you start wrecking relationships, and you have conflict. And so assumptions, if we don't verify them, they're extremely dangerous. Proverbs, or Jesus talks about judging others. Proverbs 18 in multiple places, it says, fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. A sign of relationally immature people is someone that is not willing to test an assumption. They just assume they know what the other person's motivations are, what they're thinking. Somehow like you can read their mind. That's a sign of relational immaturity. To answer before listening, that's folly and shame. The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge. The ears of the wise seek it out. A sign of relational maturity is we seek out truth. We seek out what is right. And if we think something, but we don't know for 100% with 100% certainty, we test it. We confront it. We have a conversation about it. And so one of the principles that we're going to deal with in the series is never assume you know what a person is thinking or feeling. You want to clarify your assumptions. Don't just assume you know what they're thinking or feeling, no matter how well you know that person. And things change over time. Maybe what was true in the past isn't true anymore, but we're still working off of a assumption. And so don't assume you just know what a person's thinking or feeling. Clarify your assumptions. Now, like the sibling to assumptions are expectations. Like they're pretty much related. You can use them interchangeably. Some people do. In my mind, I think assumptions are more about thoughts and motivations. Expectations are about actions and behaviors, right? When we deal with expectations, it's what do we expect someone to do? And expectations are a big deal. People quit jobs over unmet expectations. Marriages end over unmet expectations. Friendships fall apart over unmet expectations. Churches split over unmet expectations. And expectations are a part of every relationship. When I was full-time on staff here, I did a lot of weddings. And I think some years I did 10 to 15 weddings a year. And one of the things I always like to do with people I would marry is I like to do premarital counseling with them. And so we get together 3 or 4 times. And one of the things I would do in one of the sessions is I have this sheet of expectations, and I would give it to each of them to go fill out and score themselves. And then we would come back together, and we would look at where are their differences. Because in a marriage, you bring all kinds of different expectations into the relationship. So I looked at the paper for this week, and I grabbed a few of the questions or statements. So here's a couple. Who is responsible for mowing the grass? For cooking dinner? Who manages the money? Who pays the bills? We should each individually have at least one night out with friends. Should we? Is that per week? Is that per month? A couple should spend all of their recreation and free time together. Who puts the kids to bed at night? Well, it's the father's job to discipline the children. As your parents get older and if they need, is it okay for them to come and live in the house? How about your adult children? Can they come back and live at the house? You shouldn't spend over $100 without consulting each other first. Now, there are no right or wrong answers to these things, right? There's not right or wrong answers, but all of you, based on how you were raised, based on what you see in the movies and on the songs you listen to and in your personal relational history, you have different thoughts on these topics. And most couples, when they come together, they aren't intentional. Like, for example, who should fill the ice cube trays? Right? That was not something we did in our premarital counseling. If we would have, it would have helped us. But expectations aren't just about marriage, are they? Work is filled with expectations. How many days a week should I be in the office? Some companies have very clear expectations on that, many don't. How much overtime can I work? Who cleans out the refrigerator? You have a shared kitchen. Who cleans out the refrigerator? Who should load and unload the dishes? When do I get a raise, a promotion? We're in a meeting. Who's going to take notes? Who's going to send the follow-up after this meeting? Right? Some of these are bigger issues than others, and some of these are very silly, but they're all about expectations, and they all create a relational frustration if we don't deal with them, and we don't clarify them, and we don't address them. Churches. Well, the pastor should always get back to me in 24 hours. Some of you think the pastor should get back to you in like 2 hours. Some of you expect Tony to text you back in 5 minutes when you reach out. Well, the church is going to help me parent my children. My life group, seeing each other on a Sunday and once a week isn't enough. We should always hang out together even on the weekends. If I'm struggling financially, the church should help me with my utilities and rent. Sunday mornings, we need more worship. We need less worship. I'm so tired of all the slow worship. We need more fast-paced, high-energy music. I just wish we had more ministry time and more time to reflect and to contemplate. Right? It's all about expectations. Relationships are filled with expectations, and much of the relational dysfunction we have are related to us making assumptions and expectations about people, and we don't deal with them properly. Many of our expectations are unconscious. We don't even know we have them. Have you ever had that happen? Like, you've never really thought something intentionally, and then you get hurt or offended or disappointed, and you realize you were expecting someone to do something, but it was more subconscious, right? Our expectations are unrealistic. They're unspoken. They're unagreed upon. And so what's a healthy expectation look like? Well, surprisingly, it's going to be conscious, right? It's going to be something you intentionally know you have for someone else. Like, were you aware you have this expectations for a person? It's realistic. I remember when my kids started getting grades in elementary school, one of the first things, one of my first thoughts was, well, they should get the same grades I got in school. And then when you have multiple kids, you start like, okay, this is what one kid did, and I expect my others to do that as well. But each of them are incredibly gifted and talented in different ways, and they each have different things that are challenges for them, like because they're human, like we all are. Sometimes we expect things of people that are just unrealistic. They could never do that. They've never done it before. Why would we expect them to do it now? Or it's just outside of their ability. Right? If you're 5 foot, you're never going to be a professional NBA or WNBA player. Right? It's just unrealistic to expect that. I would suggest oftentimes much of the disappointment and frustration we have in ourselves is due to unrealistic expectations. Right? It's due to unrealistic expectations. This isn't just about other people. We set unrealistic expectations for ourselves as well. They've got to be spoken. Just thinking someone should do something doesn't make it valid. Have you ever thought, well, they should just know that? They should know better. They know what they should do. Ever thought that about someone? Ever told that to someone else about someone? Let me just tell you, if you ever catch yourself saying, well, they should just know that, or they should just know better, or they should just know what to do, that's a red flag of relational dysfunction. And it's not their issue, it's your issue. So if you ever catch yourself, if you ever hear someone else saying that, challenge it. Because no, they shouldn't know. You can't just assume they're going to know, or that they will fulfill your expectations. So expectations, they've got to be conscious, they've got to be realistic, and they've got to be spoken, but them being spoken isn't enough. Like, imagine we sent out an email to all of you and we said, we want you here 20 minutes before service every week. That's our expectation. You'd be like, okay, whatever. And then you show up the next week 5 minutes late and we're frustrated and mad at you. Like, no, that's an unrealistic expectation. Why? Because we spoke it, and you could do it, most of you, right? Unless you have young children, then it's just not possible. But you could do it. But what didn't you do? You never agreed upon it. Right? Has the other person agreed upon your expectation? And so when they're conscious and realistic and spoken and agreed upon, that is a valid expectation. And so one of the principles that we're going to see throughout emotionally healthy relationships is that an expectation is only valid when mutually agreed upon. So assumptions and expectations, they've got to be, you've got to test them, you've got to confirm, is that assumption valid? And if you're going to have an expectation, you've got to communicate it and get agreement. And so here's my challenge for you this week is you're going to be filled with opportunities, probably today, to do this. But I want to challenge you intentionally to think about 3 assumptions or 3 expectations. They could be small things. They don't have to be big things that you have. And maybe it's at work, maybe it's at home, maybe it's on your team or at school. But I want to challenge you 3 times this week to test out an assumption to see if it's really true. Is that really what that person thinks? Or is that really how they see this situation? Or communicate an expectation with them, your expectation, and get them to talk about it and get them to agree to it. And like I said, it could be these can be small things. Start off small. It's easier that way. But that's my challenge for you this week. As I said earlier, Sunday mornings is not going to be enough to really make progress in such a huge area as relationships. And so we are, over the next several weeks, we're doing on Wednesday nights, there's a class and small group around this topic. And so come out Wednesdays at 6:30, be here, because having the information isn't enough. Being inspired isn't enough. You need to talk about, well, what if I communicate an expectation and they say no? Like, what do I do about that? Right? Or what if we just don't see eye to eye? Like, you need to wrestle through these things and talk about them and practice doing some of these skills in a safe place. And so come out on Wednesday nights at 6:30, because that is how you're really going to make progress. And it's going to impact your relationship with God, and it's going to impact your relationship with others. There's also 2 resources. There's a workbook that you can get. I think we have some here, and then it's also on Amazon. And there's videos that actually go along with each of the topics. And so if you like a workbook, go get the workbook. There's also a 40-day, day-by-day journal or devotional. It's a devotional. And it's another phenomenal resource. These are just ways, though, that will help you go deeper, because we don't want to be immature relationally. We want to be a community and a church that not only does ministry well and outreach well and is faithful and we worship well, but we want to be a community that handles our relationships well. Our relationships inside this spiritual family and outside as well. Because if we do that well, it will set us apart and it will help people encounter Jesus. Father, we come to you today. I know for many of us, there's people we probably thought about and situations we thought about that we've not handled well or that are just difficult right now. And God, I pray you would give us wisdom. Father, I pray you would give us insight and encouragement, Lord. Some of this may have brought back memories of past relationships that fell apart or didn't go well. And I thank you that you're a God of second chances. I thank you that you're a God that never gives up on us, Lord, and even if relationally we've not pursued you well, you keep pursuing us. And so, Father, I pray during this ministry time that this would be a time of healing, that this would be a time of encouragement, that this would be a time of encountering you. In Jesus' name. Jesus' name. Well, we're going to do a time of response here, so there's going to be a couple things going on. There's communion around the room, and you don't have to be a member of the church. As long as you love Jesus, you're welcome to go and get the elements and celebrate communion by yourself or with people you came with, or just go grab someone, a friend or something. There's also going to be some people up front here that would love to pray for you and minister to you. Maybe as we were sharing this morning that a conversation that you need to have came up, like you thought about it, like I need to have this conversation, but it's hard and there's some worry around that. Don't leave here just with carrying that weight alone. Let someone else combine their faith and pray for you in what's ahead. And maybe today brought up some serious unmet expectations or disappointments in your life. And if that's the case, God wants to minister to you in that. And let him create some space and come up and let someone else minister to you about the disappointment or the pain maybe that you're carrying around from past relationships or hurts or wounds. This is a time to encounter Jesus.